morning, everyone. Good morning. There we are. Welcome to the 42nd UGAT conference. This is a continuation of yesterday's. Our kickoff was with Dr. Gideon Lasco, but today we have one of our UGAT elders, Dr. Mary Racelis, who will be talking on virtual fieldwork, COVID-19 and anthropology of encounter. So, next slide. This event is sponsored by UGAT with our host from De La Salle University, and the Luzon webinar is also co-sponsored by Ateneo de Manila University. Before we begin, a few house rules. Please make sure that your mics are turned off during this session, especially when the speaker is presenting. Turn off your video camera to conserve our bandwidth. And if you have questions at any moment, you can post them in the chat box. We encourage you so that this becomes an interactive webinar. Raise your hand during the Q&A should you want to ask the speaker a question. And close running notifications or apps to avoid internet disruptions so that we avoid lagging. Your screen must be on speaker view, and make sure to submit an evaluation. Maybe the secretariat can post a link as well later on. Okay. Now, these are all the conferences. Like I mentioned, Dr. Gideon Lasco gave his talk, and we are now on November 17. After the Luzon webinars, if you are able to see the screen, then we could see that we also have we end on the 20th for the roundtable discussion. Tomorrow, we hope to see you again. And then on 21, we begin our regional conference and Visayas Regional Conference. Our roundtable discussion, also through our host, LaSalle, we have 5 discussants. Dr. Maria Mangajas, who was our past UGAT president, will also, and we'll have discussions on the IP integration of IP higher education institutions. And there are discussions. All of these details are also found in our website. You can scan this QR code for those who are very techy, but for people like me, you can just go ahead and we will put the evaluation form at the end of the program, or in the chat box, please, from our secretariat. How do you become a member, of UGAT? You can click on this link again, ugat-aghamtao.org, and the details are all in the website. If you wish to request for certificates, right now, our webinar, our series of events are for free, and you can just click here if you wish to request for a certificate. Okay. Yesterday we had news. We received news about another fallen UGAT elder. So in this convocation, could we please request that we also include in our intentions the passing of one of our UGAT elders, Dr. Aurora Roxy Lim. She was retired faculty of the UP, but in her retirement, she continued to be very productive, teaching both at Ateneo and UP, in UP Asian Center, as well as in the Ateneo Chinese Studies program at Ateneo de Manila University. So please include her in our intentions when we do this prayer, this convocation.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Kayang magiliw, telas ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dikit mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, kuya ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, di ka pasisigil, sa nagatak tutok sa simoy at sa langit kong bagaw, ay hinatang tulak, awit sa paglayang
ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Kayang magiliw, telas ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dikit mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, kuya ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, di ka pasisigil, sa nagatak tutok sa simoy at sa langit kong bagaw, ay hinatang tulak, awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na
Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, no? UGAT members from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, and everyone who is listening in, thank you very much for joining us today. It is with great honor for me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mary Racelis, who is also a very active UGAT elder and who has always been very steady joining us. Dr. Racelis joined the Ateneo de Manila faculty in June 1960. She's the first woman professor in the college. Father Frank Lynch then starting both the Institute of IPC and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology invited her to be among his first staff members. And Dr. Racelis was born in Manila in 1932 of a Filipino father and American mother. She received her elementary education in the Philippines and finished high school and college in New York, Cornell University, Sociology and Anthropology in 1954. She completed her MA as Sociology at the University of the Philippines in 1960. In 1975, De La Salle University awarded her a doctorate in the social sciences honoris causa. And in 2003, the Ateneo de Manila University awarded her a doctorate in humanities honoris causa. She also teaches at the University of the Philippines, by the way. And so, without ado, I introduce to you, I give the floor to Dr. Mary.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. I hope you can see me or at least hear me. So thank you, Dr. Suyan, for that generous introduction. I'm never hesitant to reveal my age because other people will do it for me anyway. And basically, I'm thankful I got this far because I know so many people, including many of you who are probably listening today. So especially to my students and other colleagues with whom I've worked, hello, hello to you all. When I was asked to give this talk on the anthropology of encounter, I said, what does that mean, encounter? And as I began to think about it, of course, that's what anthropologists do all the time, is encounter people whose lives they want to know more about, whose lives perhaps they want to influence because of their connections with them. But it's a continuous back and forth relationship with what an encounter is all about. Go to the first slide, second slide. Was what does encounter mean now for anthropologists, given that we have COVID-19, right? All right, so we haven't gotten to slide 2 yet. All right, here we are. So we're faced with, how can you be an anthropologist if you can't go to a community? So initially you kind of panic. Is my anthropology life over? Of course, you realize once you get calmer, there are ways of reaching people. We just have to be more flexible, more creative in the process. And that is challenge, I'm sure, everyone who's listening to us today. But of course, that's what we're faced with. No person-to-person community encounters. So what happens to participant observation? What happens to kwentuhan, which we like to think about more as the anthropological technique? And then basically data gathering so that we can begin to understand what's happening with that particular group of people. So the question is raised first, but then it forces you to rethink. Can you do field work in this situation of COVID, which is locked down? You can't go out. You certainly cannot go to the communities, even if you can go out. And you're not sure the communities might be able to welcome you if they're locked down in the process, or if they have too many other things to do than worry about and interested anthropologists. So it does force you to begin to see things from their point of view. Well, that has always been the image of anthropology, or the commitment, the value set of anthropology, that you always try to see life through the eyes of those whom you are working with. If you want to say studying, although we're a little bit hesitant about using that term these days, right? But the whole notion of how will they see this? What do I have to know to keep them interested and supportive of the research that I plan to do before March 2020, but now I can't do the way I originally formulated it. So aside from the immediate task of how do you reach people, approach people, get valid information, and still react to people in a humanitarian or human context, other points begin to come in. If you have been teaching participatory research, you already know that we have been for a long time already thinking that the whole relationship with communities has to be changed. We have to move into a more partnership arrangement. Okay, what does that mean, partnerships? When, you know, they are they and we are we, and for us, sometimes they are the other, for them, we are the other. Actually, in this situation, we are now the other, because in a sense, power relations between the researcher outsider and the researcher insider have now begun to shift more in favor of the insider. Why? Because they have to decide now, are they going to engage with this anthropologist who wants to connect with them for the purposes which the person will explain. So what it does is not only force you to rethink, how am I going to deal tomorrow with an interview that I had scheduled before? Be creative, cell phone, okay. All right, the technology comes to you first. But after a while, you begin to think, what is the overall perspective that we should now have, considering our commitment in engaged anthropology, public anthropology, to the partnership norm, participatory research, which has been encapsulated these days by that phrase, community, knowledge generation, which is partnership in production or co-production, co-dissemination, and co-creativity or co-capability building. It's all now CO dash. Now, in my world of my friends, CO usually means community organizing. In this case, it's co-partnership, but in a sense, it's all connected anyway. So what I'm saying is, this situation of the pandemic has required anthropologists to try to figure out new ways of dealing with people with whom you want to connect for informational purposes and maybe just as a human being. But more than that, it forces you to rethink, what's the relationship of our science, the closest to the humanities, as some people say, to the people whom we're now seeing as partners, if you've made your commitment to that style or format of anthropology, which is now growing more and more important, popular in our field. All right, so that's what you're faced with this kind of pandemic, right? A dual orientation, the immediate technology of how, but the second is, what is the ethics? What's the overall perspective? What are the relationships? If we're talking about partners in participatory research, what does that mean in the concrete? So that's what we have to explore, and I've been trying to do that with my students, both at the Ateneo and the University of the Philippines, as well as others. All right, next slide. Okay, so looking at the problem through the lens of the community from their side. Now, when we say community, what is community? I won't go into that because that's another whole topic. But from people in a community that you have maybe been studying before or that you want to go and understand better. All right, what does it mean to those with whom you are in contact or about to be in contact. I suggest that there are at least 4 orientations that are possible from the community point of view, from the partner researchers in communities, if you want to be more specific, right? 1, you can be welcomed as a friend who is known and trusted. Why? Because you've been there. Let's quote your community. You know, anthropologists like to say my community, although we say that with a lot of hesitation these days, but that was always the notion that you link with a specific group of people who get to know you as someone who's always asking questions, strange questions, ridiculous questions from their point of view, but they willingly answer. And over time, they begin to trust you. They know that you're really interested in them and you really listen to them, and hardly anybody listens to them from outside. So you're usually very welcome once you show that you're genuinely interested and that you're really a good human being, someone they can trust. If you have that relationship, you will have really no problem, assuming they have cell phones, of course, but most, or at least a high proportion, do. Even in urban poor communities, rural poor, indigenous communities, a high proportion of people already have cell phones. So you can call them up and chat and find out how do we get information that's important, not only for me, but actually more important for you, right? And that is the notion of participatory research, as I think many of you know, that your research is done because it significantly helps the community achieve something through the knowledge that's being generated that they might not have been able to get if you hadn't helped them do that, right? So the idea is they have lots of issues that they want to address. And if, as a participatory research anthropologist, you go in, you connect with them to see, well, what are those issues? What's doable? And that's what community organizers do also at the beginning. What are the issues that face you? What's doable in terms of data gathering research that preferably you can get involved in? I can help with that, or my students can help you. But in the end, the hope is you have identified the problem, all right? Suppose the ones I know best is evictions. The government is always threatening us with evictions. So, but we have opposed it, and they're telling us, all right, how many are there? How many families are there? Who have been there longest? Who has a right to new housing? Who really, what about renters? Are they entitled to anything, et cetera, et cetera? So there's the problem. They've been faced with a problem. They need information to answer questions which might have an advantage for them if they can get it on a good, solid basis. So that's just one example of many, and I'm sure many of you have other examples you could give. But the idea is, in participatory research, engage anthropology. Ideally, the problem is defined by the community and you latch onto that. You're part of their process and problem solving. And because they trust you, they know you, if you want to write it up in a journal outside about them, that's fine, right? Often they know that you will first check with them that what you're saying about their interpretations are valid from their point of view, but that they will be represented honestly, even if maybe you have other ways of putting it, right? So that now begins to be serious. Right? You have to get serious about this because you cannot go there personally and negotiate all of these things on site. Wonderful if you have that kind of relationship. But many of us, even if we have a relationship in one such community or two such communities, we want to go more than that. We want to explore, other kinds of situations. And there, you say, where am I need to find out, who has access to water and who doesn't have access to water, right? In the city of Manila, let's say. So there's a part of, say, Manila that Manila City that I've heard is still waterless, especially after this typhoon. Now, I want to go to that community, but I don't know anybody there. But I know an NGO has been working there for years, or I know the church social action group that has also been working there in, in health and so on, children's concerns and women's concerns and so on. So you connect with someone who knows them. And because tried and true in the Philippines, if you know someone who knows someone, and the middle one is trustworthy, then you, by definition, by being a friend of that trustworthy person who knows them, is also trustworthy. At least they will give you the benefit of the doubt, and you will enter. That's why anthropologists who have connections with NGOs on the ground, working on the ground, who already established trust with the community years and years ago, are at a great advantage. I must say I am one of those, part because I've been involved with selected groups of NGOs for many years. I sit on the board of several of them, so that if I call them up and say, can you introduce me to Aling, say, Nena and that community? I've never been there, but you're working there, right? Or do you know the other NGO who's working there? And so on. So through your networks, you establish a connection on the ground through linkages, which really basically are built on levels of trust, right? But you can coast on someone else's trustworthiness to them because you are a friend. So you are, they don't know you, but now you say, could you let me talk to yourself about what's the situation with water now, and so on. Did you have water before? Some of them didn't have water before anyway, right? And so on. So, all right, that's another scenario. The third is one where you don't really know anybody there. You don't know anyone who knows anyone there, but you want to go into that area because, again, they are the ones where malnutrition rates of children have been shown to be the highest, let's say in Quezon City, right? But you don't know anybody in that community, and you don't know any NGOs or church groups or whoever, or faith-based groups. So you cautiously contact somebody, maybe through the barangay, go through official means, and you get put in touch with someone. There you, of course, have to be wary, because if the persons that the barangay person has said should answer your questions is someone who doesn't really like the barangay or doesn't trust the government or doesn't trust the barangay, then you have a problem. If they trust the barangay or will do it because the barangay says so, and your questions are not that intrusive from their point of view, but pretty standard, then they may go along with it. Or let's say you're a UP, you can say, I'm a graduate student from UP or from Ateneo or LaSalle. I think probably UP usually gets better entry because people know more about UP being more on their status, shall we say, than the images of the LaSalle and Ateneo, I have to say, since I belong to all three. But it's really very flexible. But again, so that kind of scenario, number three, poses lots of problems. And there you have to be careful of who introduced you to them. You got in somehow, but that gatekeeper, whoever it was, is very important in terms of the credibility and of your data from the people whom the barangay captain, for example, has chosen. I mean, if you go to the police chief, well, forget it. I mean, maybe you can get certain data, let's say EJK data, from the police side, but you have to assess what does that mean if you're talking to people into whom the police captain, precinct captain introduced. Because people are, well, it comes to EJK, we know people were very afraid. If they talk about the subject, they might get picked up whether or not they're drug users and so on. We know that whole thing. So anyway, there where you're not known, but somehow you get in, you have to be very careful of what kind of data are you getting, and you always have to assess it. And then fourth is where there's absolutely hostile. They had an experience with researchers before who let's say trumpeted in social media that the things they were saying, let's say IP communities, you went in IP community, they gave you whatever information they had, and then you wrote something online which maybe got misinterpreted, saying that, well, the NAWASA, or not NAWASA now, it's MWSS, did interview them, and the IPRA people, you know, understood were there, and NCIP rep was there. So for them to say that the data on, you know, about, let's say the mountainside, you know, the dam, you know, for example, the Kaliwa Dam, that's a contentious thing. IPs are saying we were not really consulted properly. Only a few were, and well, allegation is that maybe they were paid to say that it's all right. And so MWSS says, yes, we consulted, and DNR says, yes, they were consulted. NCIP says, yes, they were consulted, but many of the community groups are saying that 4 out of 5 communities have gone to agreement that they were not properly consulted. And we know what consultation can mean, you know, in terms of the variations of modes of consultation, how genuine are they? And anyway, supposing you did the research and then you report online that although people say they were not properly consulted, in fact, there is a group that wants the Kaliwa Dam to be built, right? And, all right, so that goes all over the media, and all the Stop the Kaliwa Dam people who are supporters of IP groups and environmental groups and so on, all get upset at you for why do you say that when you think you're just explaining what you heard in the field. But nonetheless, you know, you will be forever damned, and anybody else after you who says they're an anthropologist interested in their views will, whether it's a miscommunication, will not be tolerated. All right, so those are, of course, extreme examples, and you hope that it doesn't happen, but it does happen. And now with the community or community people deciding who is going to come in, whom are they going to talk to, who is trustworthy, who is to be feared, etc. These innuendos or these variations now have to be taken much more seriously. Okay, so they are othering us until because of trust and factors, we are no longer others to each other. Right? Next. Communities also have to assess what are the risks, the stakes. You know, who is going to gain from this? Who's going to lose? Or doesn't it matter? Who will not be affected? And who's going to decide? All right, and that's a whole complex thing because, as you know, barangay community may have, let's say, 2,000 people in it, but there might be 4 different main views about a particular issue. So there's a lot of heterogeneous views that what community organizers try to do is try to get enough agreement or unity that they can move ahead with certainty. But that is also there. So what are some of the things maybe they are thinking about? What is the context? What are their prior experiences? One, if they know you, they want to maintain a long-standing friendship. They may recognize that the data were useful to them as a community because you worked with them before and your data were useful, something they did to convince the NHA that they actually, not everybody can afford the down payments that NHA says everybody can afford, all right? So you do data, some of us have done that, Melis Navarra, some of you know, sociologist at Ateneo, has done some very good work, survey work with community groups exactly on that issue of who's paying and who's not paying and why, you know, the installments on NHA property that they have moved into. All right. They will show general hospitality and recognition to friends of friends. They might hesitate or be reluctant for people they don't really know and might ask, what is the purpose of this? They have to guess, is this valid? Is it possibly going to harm us? And so on. Of course, that has implications for reliability. And of course, they may also choose not to participate or simply participate, but give fake responses. right? Next. All right, so what are some of the ways that we have actually done that? Cell phone interviews are now the thing, right? Let me just say, I was trying to list before, how have I, specifically gone through this? First, the first week that we had lockdowns, of course, we were very concerned what's happening in the communities we know. And so I called my NGO friends who work there, the community organizers who work there, to say, is it okay? I can call the leaders? And they said, yes, we can arrange it. They know you, no problem. And so I did one-on-one interviews. Each was about an hour and a half, of at least 4 of the communities that I know. And I had a whole list of COVID-related questions. And I discovered from the interview, this is the third week of March, very soon after the lockdown, that for them, and we know this now, COVID is not the issue at that time. The issue was, as they say, mamamatay kami sa gutom, hindi sa COVID. So they were worried about, would they get, the government is promising this or that, but they hadn't gotten it yet the first couple of weeks. So they were worried about hunger, the fact they couldn't go out to earn, and we all know that history. But the fact that we got it very early on, and I didn't put it in an academic journal, to say the least. I asked Rappler if they would like to produce it, and they immediately said yes. So I said, it's a joint interview, and the author is the leader. The first name has to be the leader's name because the message or the information comes from that person. All I did was interview him or her, write it up in the ways that trying to portray what that means, maybe make my own commentary at the end, but always check with them. Is this correct? Is this accurate? One of the things I found out, I always check, should I use your name or not? Your name is going to be there. And I think in all but one case, they said, yes, these are community leaders, so they're very strong, and they had no problems with that. And I think they liked the fact that their name appears in Rappler. So they felt, I think, quite happy about that. But again, because I knew them. And well, there are many others. Maybe I'll talk about them as we go. All right, so cell phone interviews, many of you have now gotten into that with people you know, and then they refer you to others whom you can interview because you need to get women and young people and LGBTs and more of a spread of informants whom you don't usually connect with, but they will introduce you, so that works okay. Again, if you're in that first category of trusted, or the second category, trusted because they know somebody who trusts you. Okay. Then we have focus group discussions on Zoom with respondents brought together by local leaders and NGOs. I participated in several of those. The first one was really a riot. It was fun. They were all excited because they were on their cell phones, and it's the first time they had ever been on a Zoom. And so someone was saying, why is my son had their pictures on? Bakit yung picture ko wala? Well, because kasi, and then you can hear the roosters are crowing in the background, and the dogs are barking, and the children are screaming, and the tricycle is moving, and other people in the Zoom are saying, Aling Nani, yung mute mo, patayin mo yung mute mo. Anong ibig sabihin ng mute? Mute, yung tingnan mo sa lower left, yung ganon. So it was fun, and they had fun just learning all from their mistakes how you do a Zoom. Now they're expert at it. No more problem. They know exactly what it entails. Okay. Next. So in those discussions, all right, you're not doing actual interviews of them because they're there to solve a problem they have, how are they doing in the COVID situation. But just by listening to them, facilitated by the NGO or the PO leaders, then you get a lot of data that way. Oh, now there's a big red exclamation point in front of it. My screen. What is that? Okay, anyway, I think I have it on my own. Online Zooming for one. You know, my screen is black. Hold on. All right. So, yeah, all right. We have to go back to the sheets. All right, good. Okay. All right. When people that you want to interact with are getting on online technology, as we know, it's a challenge for everybody, older generation especially, but actually, you know, for those who don't have access to laptops and who have never been in that so much, other than the younger ones. So they need kind of training, a learning process. You have a lot of patience, how to collect data. Because they're the ones now who are really asking the questions, you have to do a little learning session on how you ask questions, and you don't ask leading questions, and you give examples of that. You know, the usual training like you do, except now these are with people who are not used to this kind of interaction, although interaction with the community is their line of work. We have the transmission of photographs using, you know, Messenger, all of that, no? So there's a whole learning for all of us, right? Because we're not all sure how do you screen save and get everybody on and so on. So what we have learned from different kinds of community involvement is, number one, do they have a signal, right? If they have a signal, how strong is it? Is there a time of the day or night when it's stronger than usual, right? We thought we had this already solved before school started, right? Because you could do it almost any time of the day or night, it'd be more or less all right. Then when school started and all the children are trying to get on the internet, or even if the city has given them tablets, you have a tablet, sometimes more if they're fortunate. And so internet use is, your children have to have first priority. Therefore, parents are not going to insist that they're going to meet, you know, between 10 and 3, which is when their children are doing their work. So you have to adjust. And that's the process, you know, constant process. When is the signal working? The second is load. We, a group of us at the Ateneo had been already discussing research in the Pang-Aghamtao floodway community, Apu-Amf community. And we found that so we had planning meetings on Zoom with them, but we discovered that many of them had to check out early because the load, we're not saying load because you're on a cell phone. So because we wanted, the idea is something, it's connected with the NGO and the PO who want to get into sustainable development goals, particular ones, you know, on education, health, and employment. So they were interested in continuing, but they said, you know, we have a problem with the load. And we said, well, we have funds for this research. So instead of using the funds for travel of us and where our students were supposed to go to your community, we will shift that to load for you, right? And the same thing, there was also a community journalism program, which was also with funding. And there, the idea was to train community journalists. Luz Rimban of the Asian Center for Journalism, Ateneo, is the one there in charge. And because she provided, through the project funds, them with the videos for them to decide, you know, what's important. If they're going to worry about education, what about it? Can they display it? And she trains them on how you do it, what are the ethics of filming children and all of that, right? So, but the issue of load becomes very crucial. So if you really want to do research, whether you have project funds or not, you have to consider the fact that they are definitely, you know, using load, which is very scarce and valuable for them. space and timing for maximum benefit. Okay, it's not only at the time of the signal, but also, you know, the time of the day. If their kids are there, or the daytime is really very difficult because everybody's in the house, especially if they're locked down. They can't, if it's an urban poor community, they can't go outside. So you have to reckon is there's going to be a lot of noise. The children are going to be in the background looking to see what their mother is doing, at least for a while. Somebody is cooking in the background. And what the women have, often the women who are doing have learned is that their asawa should not be getting dressed in the behind her on the screen, because everybody in the world can see and getting things like that you learn as you go. I mean, usually people laugh about it, but you know, this is part of the learning process all around. The privacy issue is virtually nil if you're talking about urban poor anyway. And so how do you deal with that? You know, have to come to terms with that somehow. We've already talked about the competition with the children's schoolwork. What I definitely want to bring out is that we have found, and many of you who work in urban poor communities have found, that it's women who are the decision makers, basically about community events and how, and sharing of the material that came in, whether it's through the government, through NGOs. They knew who in the neighborhood didn't get, who should have gotten, and they tell the kapitan, no, you know, you forgot them, or DSW, you forgot them, but they're not on the list because they were away when somebody made the listahan, et cetera, et cetera. They know the details. And we have seen many of them, when they got their share and they found that the neighbor or their friend didn't, they share. Among them, they decide that they have to kind of reassess and distribute among others who didn't get. Of course, they know that in future, if something like that happened where they were the victim, that they would also get that kind of caring. And the community side is really crucial in kinds of emergencies like this. Of course, as they tell us in urban poor communities, but for us, every day has been a disaster. You know, we face an emergency every day, many of us who are really very poor. And so this is not really new to us. We always have to find some way of making it through. Now, of course, there are those who say, see the resilience. So some people now love that term, but as I think we all know, many of us are really reacting against it, because resilience, while it's valid, amazing how, you know, disadvantaged or marginalized people manage somehow to survive or find ways to move. But that is often used as an excuse for why government doesn't have to do much because people are resilient. You know, and that, of course, is now being widely rejected, that government is accountable and they cannot rely only on people's resilience because they are supposed to be providing the counterpart assistance to communities which are handling a lot of their own issues and problems. And in a way, it's very sad that in this administration, you know, the very top-down approach and the view of communities as pasaway for the most, you know, you get that image is always being pushed, and surveillance. Every urban community has police and even military nearby, if not immediately there. So people have a sense they don't trust us, they're afraid to move. And it's such a loss, because the government, if you don't trust your people and you don't let them or encourage them to fend for themselves with the resilience they do possess, you lose a tremendous amount of energy and resources and goodwill. You know, so pay attention to community strengths, not always looking at, of course there are weaknesses, but the community strengths are amazing, and they come out very much under emergency situations, whether it's flooding, whether it's like, et cetera, right? Okay, well, I think I've talked about the surveillance is not the way to go. I mean, it may be partly necessary, but government has to, especially local government, because they kind of know the people on the ground. They really have to foster good relations, and many of them do. We have very good examples, as you know. I won't highlight them, but you know them, where local officials have managed to have very good connections, and because they rely on people's willingness to participate, they go very far in achieving successes which the city could never achieve without their support. Right? Okay, going on to dealing with online technology. We've already, it should be the next one. So what we're facing is new norms for virtual research. This is virtual research. Let me reemphasize some things I've already said. Trust and personal ties are crucial, directly or through NGOs. And for those of us who are academically based, you know, this is something I have been trying to stress ever since, for years, that academics have to be on the ground, not only as researchers, but as partners with those who care about people on the ground, either as partners with local community groups, if you want directly. Usually it's through NGOs who are on the ground, working with them and trying to develop, help them find new ways of dealing with their lives more successfully from their point of view. I've often encouraged my academic friends, and some of them have taken that advice, fortunately, to sit on an NGO board. You know, it's very important because NGOs tend to have other NGOs sitting on them, which is fine. But sometimes an academic who has, you know, our role is kind of to look at it from a larger perspective without imposing that, can get people to, you can facilitate a discussion that looks at the larger issues. Because of course, they're always concerned with the immediate, logically. But sometimes when you're looking at what does this mean next year, you know, what are the possibilities? That's where academics can make a difference. And you can provide data. You can help them gather the data they need. So for me, the big missing link I see for many academics is they have no intermediate connections with communities, right? And that is really a loss. And what I realize that because when I look at the literature on social change and so on, there's very little mention of NGOs and what they are doing. NGOs, social development workers of all kinds, faith-based groups, left parties who are on the ground. You know, there's almost no mention of them, as if they didn't exist, when we know a huge part of social change is happening in communities where they are. Academics often don't see that because they don't interact on that basis. So one of the things I hope that UGAT will actually foster more of is, well, what we're calling engaged anthropology. Many of you are already doing it, but connect with not only directly with the community, you know, you can only do one or two of those to start with, but through networks of NGOs who can bring you in, but can also draw on your knowledge and your skills to help their work. Many NGOs, you know, they say, when I say that, come on, you know, let's get some academics. They say, oh, academics, you know, that's always a stereotype. The ivory tower, they never come. They don't walk the talk. They only talk the talk, you know. So we have to establish our commitments by doing, right? Walking the talk. All right. So, right, another thing is the uses of the data and the research as a whole. Actually, I'll get into that next time when next slide, I think, when I talk about co-dissemination. Payment of community researchers. Before, face-to-face, you interview people, you don't pay them. In fact, the idea is you shouldn't pay them because that may bias your answers, you know. But if you're now we find, we're asking local leaders to mobilize, let's say, 5 other women and or men or young people to go out and do this research according to a set of guideline questions we have, and to write it up or speak it into, you know, record it in somehow, or talk to us, or relay the information to us. And it's for free. We get paid to do that. How come they cannot? You know, are they informants? Yes. But are they also researchers? Yes. And as researchers, all right, how do you deal with that? You know, do you actually pay them? Usually we say the community, maybe give a gift to the community, or small scale if it's focus group participants, you give them a box of cookies or half a sack of, a kilo of rice or whatever. But now that they're community researchers, co-researchers with you, because they are local leaders, or of course maybe they have a little more education, especially if you want youth, and there are many who have some or college education but no job, or high school education, who can tackle this if you need more systematic ways of thinking about information. So, the issue of payment becomes real, right? They're not just informants anymore. They are also researchers. And what is payment? There, the community is, we rely on the local community leaders to make that assessment. What is fair? It's always fair. What is fair in this case? All right, times and places for interviewing. Okay, I've already said that. Close interaction with NGO and PO communities. The gatekeepers there. You don't get everybody at once. And we go into partnerships. Next slide. Oh, let me see if I have it on my screen. Okay. Oh, there we are. Thank you. Sorry, I'm bugging the technical team here. I know they have problems. All right, what are some of the implications? I do want to hear from you, your views, your own experience. You may have approaches that we haven't thought of yet that have worked. We want to hear from you. But let me just say, here is the framework in which many of us who are very much into engaged anthropology operate. We're saying this is an opportunity to reformulate research. Just as those of us who study social change say, emergency or critical traumatic times are the times that people are willing to change their orientation to something very new. Why? Because the situation is now different and people are more willing to take risks than before. Generalization, of course. And the same applies to research. We now have an opportunity to reformulate research since so much of the decision-making is now in the community hands. And let's break that down into three portions. Knowledge generation through, I should have said co-production. I forgot that, terrible. Co-production, that the problem formulation ideally is with the community. Now, you make that commitment. Let's say one I know was in the Tondo area. They were being evicted, threatened as always, and they were saying that in the new place where they, not so far away, where they might be relocated, this is how much they're going to have to pay, NHA, right? And they said, but we can't pay that. Not everybody can pay it. Some can afford it, but the majority can't. So they did research, and the NGO that was working with them, I think, and this was Urban Poor Associates, helped them, and fortunately they have community organizers who have social science training, undergraduate, right? Help them do the research on household income, and they got others to help, and academics, I think, also to help so that the data are valuable. And they got the breakdown, by household themselves. What do you spend for? The usual, food, transportation, et cetera, and they presented the data to the National Housing Summit, which had undersecretaries and ASECs there of all the departments under the organization of then Congressman Benitez, who was in charge of housing. So, and what they, and they pointed out there's a variation, but they had tables and all of that. So of course the undersecretaries were amazed, that, quote, uneducated or limited education people could produce this and articulate it. They knew the data because they had gathered the data. They had been there when it was discussed, assessed, analyzed, right? And so one of the things that was missing was health. And the health person, Undersecretary or ASEC, said, oh, why, you don't think health is important? You don't even have that on your budget. And the woman leader of that community in Tondo said, of course we know health is important, but you know, yung araw-araw, pag araw-araw, we have to have transportation, we have to have food. You know, these are the items, if we have to pay rent, we have to pay the rent. Health, maybe nobody will get sick. You hope nobody will get sick, but so you don't include it. But if somebody gets sick, of course we have ways to handle it. If we don't take them to the hospital, the center, we borrow from the neighbor to buy medicine and so on. We have yung mga paraan to get it solved, right? So that really blew their minds. You know, they had never thought of it that way. So these are some of the great advantages when people handle their own research, co-production, co-formulation of the problem. And we, as outside social scientists, say that's their issue, but from that, I could write a whole article for a peer-reviewed journal on data management when you connect with communities, right? So it's not that you lose out, you gain by working with people in this way. And they're very happy if you use the data because they know you and you help them and so on, right? Dissemination is another issue. You know, who is going to be sent to? You might want to send it to, let's say, the local government because you're a consultant to them to how to improve their relations with communities. But this community might say, wait a minute, hey, they're the ones, you know, they're threatening us with eviction. It's the police that come from the city. It doesn't come from NHA, it comes from the city. So why are we going to give them information about us and they're going to use that against us, etc. right? So you have to come to terms with that. Mostly, you know, those are the special situations. Same thing with publication rights. I have been very committed to, with the NGOs that I work with in communities and the community leaders, that whatever is circulated has to come out in Filipino. That's number one, right? They have to be able to read it, or in visuals, right? With nice graphics in Filipino again, right? That's local publication. Publication meaning for their own use, dissemination. But it means if you are going to partner with them, as we did when I did the research for the interviews with local leaders, you publish jointly. Their name, I put them on as the main partner, right? And I was second because in principle, I thought that was right. It doesn't have to be like that all the time, right? But in this particular case, I thought it was important. And my students who did similar research with 4 new communities or other communities did the same. And I thought it was a way of getting them as young anthropologists to understand that there are stakes all around, including yours. And you have to be more humble that you are not the senior, necessarily the senior writer, if this is in a public, you know, in a popular kind of thing, especially. For academic journals, they couldn't care less, but maybe for something like Rappler, where they know people who watch it, it would count that they come out first. All right, it does mean academic restructuring because not all departments or schools or colleges are so open to social scientists working directly with communities. Of course, even more now, makes it more difficult. Actually now, maybe they're a little more comfortable because you never can go to the community, even if you want to. Before, if you went, they say, what, you're going to Tondo? What, you're going, this is a dangerous area, especially if it's with your students, undergraduates. Oh, they have to get their parents have to agree, and so on and so on. So, but I must say, I have to say that the Ateneo is very good on students now really have to connect. And that's part of our coursework. They have to connect with communities, and there's a whole system that enables them to do that. Fortunately, for some of the NGOs I work with, and Manis Navarra, for example, Apo Amphin in Mangahan, we had a project there. I had a project with other theology, believe it or not, which wants to understand spirituality from the bottom up, community journalism, Ateneo human rights. We all got together, we got money to do research to help with the SDGs formulation of the NGO together with Apo-Am in education, health, and employment. It so happened that the sociology graduate course in social statistics was also going to be on this past quarter, or this semester. So together with Melis, I said, how about doing that survey in the community so we have a baseline for when this started, and we will know, they will know, and it's participatory, so they will know, what happened from this year to next year, which is the end of the research project. And so that came on. It's wonderful. The serendipity is fantastic. And we've done that also undergraduate, with undergraduates in the Manila North Cemetery, the ones who live in the cemetery, the group of my students together with, who are also sociology students. Well, my students were in the general course under the economics department, but they happen to be the social majors. And so they connected through the Ateneo outreach system with the MNL, partly also because Melis, who was the sociologist in charge of the research with Jesse Custodio, and she knew that community, so they got together, and the students just listening, to the kwentuhan, I think, changed their mind. I could have lectured 3 semesters. It wouldn't have had as much impact as the 2 intensive kwentuhan they had, and then the subsequent research that they're now doing. And the same thing, there's another group of them who are doing similar research on in Mandaluyong on early teenage pregnancy. And that was highlighted by Unang Hakbang Foundation, which has been working with them for years with young people, and saw the effects of teenage pregnancies. But what really alarms them is the young teenager from 12 to 15 who are pregnant. And they say in the studies of teenage pregnancy, very few are really separating out that particular younger group, which has another whole set of concerns from the older teenagers. And see, they identified the problem, and the students, our students, again, with the social department and the economics students whom I'm teaching, are now in there or discussing, doing the research there with the local community, young people, right? So they connect with the young people who have defined the problems, explaining what is it, why is it that this happens, and how do people feel, and what do the parents feel, and so on and so on. So the results are really, exciting. They really dynamize the whole research enterprise. And for students who normally would not have the opportunity to do that, even virtually, are excited and have been writing good papers and commit, even though the semester quarter for me is over, they continue to in young blood so that their experience can be reflected there, etc. So, new ideas begin to develop and dissemination. So creativity, capacity building is all around. It's not only the communities that gain a lot and learn a lot, but those of us who are working with them also learn a lot in the process, right? But you have to make a basic commitment that you are partners in this research, and you have to adjust because sometimes it doesn't go the way that you're used to it. Okay, next. I think I'm getting to the end here. All right, the last 2 slides. So just to summarize, what are the opportunities in the new normal? 1, we're enabling scientists to interact as partners with communities. But I added their language, because one of the things I've learned is interacting a lot with communities, with NGOs, mobilizing, whether it's the Manila Bay Sustainable Development, where the government, is thinking of evicting thousands of fisher folk along the entire Manila Bay, and they're all fighting that. And parts of the government are quite sympathetic, I have to say. Some people in NED are very sympathetic to that perspective, that there is a human side to all of this, Anyway, all right, so the NGOs then now realize they don't have the technical knowledge in sciences, say biology, the marine environment, the weather situation. So they're calling in scientists who know this stuff. And they usually call scientists who already kind of know, who are known to be quite sympathetic, who want to help people at the grassroots level. But one of the things we found out is that while they are super in tailoring the topic so that people can understand it, many of them cannot say it in Filipino. They can say it partly Filipino, partly English. But I remember one group, later after all, I said, oh, ano, kumusta kayo? Did you, was it okay, yung sinabi ng scientist? They said, oh, maganda siguro ma'am, pero hindi namin naintindihan siya. They didn't get it because he couldn't explain it in Filipino terms because we're not used to that I think anthropologists more are, but the biologists, the chemists, so on, are not. So, but it's the process of bringing them in because the NGOs are the gatekeepers often. They bring them in, and because they get so uncomfortable realizing they're not making the kind of connection they had hoped, they begin to learn themselves that they have to improve their Filipino, let's say in this case, all right? And I'm one of the worst to talk about that because, say at least my Filipino is, having had English as my mother tongue from my American mother, well, you'll have to excuse me there.
Oh, Dr. Mary, we have a few minutes. We have, it's time we can maybe have our last points and before we ask others for open the floor for question and answer.
All right, let me just then, it's a broader dissemination of data and ideas in anthropology, other social sciences, and you bring out community voices and significance of research partnerships. And I think it's the last one. The last slide is encountering the new normal, right? Because we're social scientists, we're looking at social, and with certain, especially engaged, social injustice, structural violence, income inequality, poverty, human rights violations. We begin to be partial to research that explores that further on the ground. And we try to bring out successes where community voices have been heard to show government and policymakers and the private sector that if you consider people as your equals, you have a lot to gain. Youth, very important, and to get them involved in for these values commitments. Clearly, we need structural changes, and that's what the new normal should very much be concerned about, as well as finally, the accountability of social scientists in academia, in government, in private sector, in social development. We are accountable to our discipline, but our discipline in a new normal, which is the anthropology of encounter is now it. And so that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I think there are some questions in our chat box. We have one from Don David Ramos, with this novel approach, how do we deal with issues of research ethics? Is there a need to re-examine ethics? I won't stop here. I'll continue his question. For example, how do we deal with challenges like the need for people to have load? Those are the one things that you mentioned. In order to communicate with researchers and the need for data, in terms of access to internet. So these are two questions he asked, two challenges that he is responding to, Dr. Mary.
Okay, let me start with the ethics side. Yes, we need a whole rethinking of that. Even before this COVID happened, anthropologists especially, and sociologists working very much on the ground in an engaged way also, have queried a lot of the ethics panels which have been set up in many universities, understandably, because it's important. Our concern, that especially anthropology and sociology, I think, has been that the ethics norms or the framework has come out of psychology. And psychology has come in because of the need to protect human subjects, right? And that's totally understandable. you cannot violate use people as to experiment on, to say the least, all right? So then you start there and you continue on that continuum. But for those of us who work on the ground, we say, you can't keep asking us, let's say, to get every person to sign off on a statement that I've done, and so on. There are all these forms now that you have to get filled up by community groups, indigenous people, and people many times who can't write or are not comfortable writing, and you humiliate them by asking them to write and so on. So we need to re-examine, especially from anthropology, because we are on the ground more than most others, in an ongoing relationship with people. I think we have to talk to ethics boards. We have to be on ethics boards so that we can explain our perspective, right? That when an indigenous community that already has welcomed you before, you don't have, and they've said, and you can even get them to sign, you don't have to go, do you have to go through the NCIP? We've tried to deal with the NCIP also, because it's valid what they have to write. All right, so what I'm saying is we need to rethink, but we have to do that systematically, and this is what UGAT definitely could get into. And by checking with the different universities, we know that, ethics boards operate because they care about correctness, but let's say because you cannot, there's so many restrictions to interview children, okay. But now I notice researchers, even the ones we did in our classes, they specifically mention teenage pregnancy, but they're not interviewing any teenagers, because to do that with children, you have to go through so many hoops that you don't have the time, etc. So they're trying to interview over 18s who were teenage pregnant, yeah. But so we have to start looking at that. What are some of the safety valves? Huh? Yeah. And what's the other one about load? If the community is organized, and if the research that you are encouraging them to do is something they want to do, well, either you can transfer some of your funds, if you're an NGO, you raise funds to pay for that load, or if they really want to do it on themselves, they will raise the funds for that. But that's why organizing becomes very important. But if you're dealing with individuals, you have to find a way of at least supporting the load. There's a line between when are you paying an informant who's not a researcher of other people, but just an informant. Do you pay them for their time, right? Because it takes 2 hours maybe, and they would be selling if they could, in the market, so they're losing a certain amount of money. Do you compensate for that? So it's not payment, it's compensation for the time they could have used to earn something else. Or do you give them a gift? Or you can, of course, be quite straight with them and just transfer your own funds, saying, because you're asking them to do this and they have a load problem, you have to get it to them. And there's PayPal, and there are ways in which you can get money, cash, actually brought to them now, as you know. But I think you do have to take that seriously. It is your responsibility if you want them to do research with you.
Okay, thank you for that question. At this juncture, I'd like to invite Rio Luna, who also posted in the chat box. I hope we can discuss more about partners, and she finds it somewhat complicated on her end. So Rio, might you please be able to share what your experience? Can you unmute yourself? Is it possible to unmute yourself? Can someone unmute her?
Yeah. Hello.
Oh, there.
Hi, Prof. Mary.
Hi.
Smalot.
Hi, Malot.
Smalot, actually, aka Rio Luna. Yeah. Hello po. I'm asking because, during during the past decade, I've been working with weavers here in Ilocos. And most of the time, they provide the information, the stories about weaving technology, about marketing, about production issues and all that. So basically, they're the ones who provide me with all the information that I write about. In a way, when we talk about compensation, because of course I'm taking also part of their time when I ask them questions, when we go through storytelling. Of course, I take their time, no. But so now, with our discussion, it's kind of we're saying that they're also like researchers, and they're making up. I mean, they're the ones. They're the sources of our data, of the things that we write about. But how do we compensate them? On my end, kasi I just took it. I just took the initiative to, kind of assist them in marketing their product. So that's my way of giving back. So, well, that's just one example. There could be others. And so I wish to discuss more on this, like, how do we compensate informants who, in a way, also become our co-researchers.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, certainly if you have a project budget for research, you have to find a way, if they are doing research, and I distinguish between being an informant, that's one thing, because again, taking time away from what they do to earn in order to talk to you, there's that aspect to compensate, but that's different from a researcher. Then, in other words, you're asking them to interview 5 different women weavers who have 5 different designs. Why is it that they chose that design versus that design? Okay, so they have become researchers. Therefore, you have to share, to me, you have to share some of your own, either if you didn't budget for that, for them, you have to share some of your own, what you earn yourself, as your fee with them, because they are your co-producers of the research. But I think, I'm sure they're very happy. If they're happy with the marketing that you're doing, that should be a good compensation. But I think it's always good to ask them. You can say, nahihiya na ako po dahil, I've been asking so much of you. Baka there's some way I can make it up to you. You don't have to say pay you, but is there some way I can help you to make it really worth, to show my appreciation for you? And often they will say, that might be something for the community, it might be something for the kids, etc. But always ask them. And once you assure them that it's not something they should be ashamed to speak out to you, they will tell you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. There's a last question here. I don't know how much time we have. Well, we have a few minutes left. Well, BB Monkey, also in the chat box, asks, how about site-specific research projects like environmental, cultural impact assessments? The researchers have to be on the field to see. How can we recalibrate or rethink our methods when it comes to this?
Yeah, well, that's where we have to be creative. One of the ways that I have learned from the communications people, especially Professor Luz Rimban, because she's also in Ateneo, is this community journalism idea. I mean, it's not that new. They've been doing it for some time, but now it becomes even more crucial because what they do is they train usually young people who can handle the technology on what is the kind of, or the discussion about, what are the topics, what should they do, and then they help guide them, usually through Zoom, in a training situation, training learning, where, like you would do in a regular class, which is a synchronous class, they role play or whatever, but they can learn, how do you choose what's important in the community? Well, maybe they should ask, or do you know, let's say, if it's a group of young men, what about the women? Did anybody interview the women? Or et cetera, or the really young kids who are struggling through school. So kind of guiding them, the questions, and through a Zoom process, you can train them how to use the technology also, whether it's a cell phone, very fancy cell phones that they now get or they need. So I think that is one way that they become your eyes in the community. That's really a new way, right? But it means you really have to train them. I hate the term barefoot, but in effect, barefoot anthropologists, if you want to say, or community anthropologists, call it that, that's better. You're training community anthropologists how to look at their world a little bit differently from the way they would as a person living there. That's what anthropologists do. So that's a whole new area. How do you train, especially I would say young people with the permission of the elders to do this? And if the data go back to the community, and always in our research now, most of our research in IPC, all our research in IPC, which deals with local communities, there's always a feedback session. We always go back and say, this is what we learned, even if the problem was not derived from them, all right? But let's say it's an issue of, I don't know what, housing or health, and they didn't frame the problem, but they participate in it. We always have a feedback session, and the community, they invite who needs to be invited. We try to encourage them to bring in the local government so the local government understands how they feel about things. Yeah, so feedback to the community is a very important part of building trust and reliability.
Okay, I think this is all the time we have for questions. Just as a reminder, no? If you look at the chat box, there's an evaluation form. Please, click on that link or copy the link and make your evaluation. And we remind you again to please request for your certificates. If you would be needing one, go to www.ugat-aghamtao.org, 42nd Conference 2020. And we'd like to invite you to please also register for the 42nd UGAT Conference. No? It's all in the link. And thank you very much, Dr. Mary. We'd like now to present to you this certificate of appreciation for always being there and very, you have always been inspired. I'll just read this out from our sponsors and from UGAT. The Ugnayang Pang-Aghamtao, UGAT Anthropological Association of the Philippines, and De La Salle University Social Development Research Center awards this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Mary Racelis as resource speaker in the 42nd UGAT Annual Conference webinar entitled Virtual Fieldwork, COVID-19 and Anthropology of Encounter. Thank you, Dr. Mary.
Thank you.
Yes. There's one last request here from our organizers to please, before we end this session, if we could have a group photo, shall we? If you're okay with it, no? I see a lot of thanks here as well for you, Dr. Mary. So if we could have a group photo before we leave. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us. Go ahead, we'll Jesse.
Yes, for our group photo, please switch on your camera if you're comfortable and we'll take a screenshot. All right, sige. Ready, 1, 2, 3, smile.
Oops.
Let's have the other screen. Ayan, maraming salamat po sa lahat.
Thank you very much. And with this, we end the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mary Racelis.
You're welcome. Sorry, I went too long, but
That's okay. It's your life work, so we understand.
I didn't look at the chat to see Skilty's message. I only saw it now. Oh wait, here. Oh, these are people I know.
Yeah, we have many members here.
Oh, I see many of my students. How nice. Yeah.
Jessie, are we done?
Yes, so we can ask everyone to leave the call, and thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.